You're listening to the Electronic Media Collective Podcast Network. Yeah, it's a mouthful. For more great shows like the one you're about to enjoy, visit electronicmediacollective.com. And now, our feature presentation.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Comics with My Kids, the official podcast for the comicscornerbox.blogspot.com, where you can get reviews of comics for the whole family. I'm your host, Matt D, and with me today is...
Logan D.
Today's episode, we have a special guest. He is the writer for the comic series Scales and Scoundrels, as well as an editor-in-chief for the TKO books. It's Sebastian Girner.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. Well, Sebastian, we're hoping to talk to you a little bit about Scales and Scoundrels and a little bit about TKO Comics and also what it's like to be an editor-in-chief. Tell you what, we'll go ahead and we'll dive right into the book.
Sploosh. So me and Dad read the first collected edition for Scales and Scoundrels, and we both really enjoyed it. Would you like to tell our listeners the elevator pitch for this series?
The elevator pitch for Scales and Scoundrels was... So the book written by myself and developed with the artist Galad. When we started, we said we wanted to do an all-ages fantasy adventure that anyone could read, that kids could pick up, that parents and adults could enjoy, and that went against the darker grain of fantasy that we saw. That was very popular at the time, Game of Thrones, other kind of grimdark stuff. And both he and I grew up reading European kind of fantasy, which always ended up being a little bit more playful. Also big fans of Japanese comics, where despite things being very serious and the stories can, have epic twists and fails and falls, there's still a lightheartedness and a sense of adventure to it. And that's something that we wanted to bring to an American comic book series, to kind of try to break comics free from fantasy comics, at least free from the kind of Dungeons and Dragony, Tolkien stranglehold. As much as we love it, and in order to do that, ironically, we set out to actually start our story in a similar spot. So, like all good fantasy adventures, it starts in a tavern. We head off into a dungeon. And then we let the characters kind of play themselves from there. Not quite sure that's an elevator pitch for you. But, that was our outset. Is that actually specifically that we didn't really have an elevator pitch. The story kind of came together from us having developed these characters and then locking them all in a room or in a dungeon together, as it were, and letting our imagination run wild with where it would go from there.
I have to say, I really enjoy your Scales and Scoundrels. I like you said, it's definitely a lighter fare. There's some nice comedy in it, especially with the lead female character Luvander. She seems like she's very much like the scoundrel, the Indiana Jones kind of character in the series. Where'd you get the inspiration for her?
So Lou came to us. So what I love about Scales, just as a writer, is that it came along. I'd been doing editing for 6 or 7 years, I think. Galad, the artist, reached out to me. We'd never met before. We only met once in like the 10 years that we've known each other almost. I'd been doing a lot of freelance editing after I left Marvel, and I was interviewed by a French comic book website about a comic that I had edited. He read that. He reached out to me just on my website, and he was an animator by trade, working on video games and character design. And he said he wanted to kind of work on a comic, and he didn't really know how. And could I help him out? And as we started talking, he started kind of sending me sketches for like, here's ideas I have, and one of the sketches was for this kind of white-haired, kind of scruffy, poofy-haired character. And I was like, who is that? And he's like, oh, this is this character I've created. I really like drawing her, and I had this idea that she could be like a dragon or a dragon something. And just in talking about that, I was like, wait, like, can you let me be inspired by her? And I wrote up like a little bit of a story draft for like, here's who she is, here's where she came from, here's the kind of arc. So like she existed before we gave her a name and gave her a history. It was just this character that he really loved to draw, and I was really kind of inspired by her. Because like you said, I really wanted a character. I wanted to write a character that is completely like kind of rudderless and not chained down, who can be here one day and there tomorrow, and to have that be a part of their character, not just a natural kind of impulse of the writer who doesn't want to commit to, any one place. But also the natural urge of a fantasy story is that you want to keep moving, you want to keep exploring the world and getting out into it. And that's why we had this cast of characters kind of built around her, so that we were very interested in not telling the reader everything about, or actually telling the reader anything about the world, not starting with a kind of treatise, like here's a map, here's the history of this world and this kingdom, blah, 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 to just kind of like drop you into it and let you experience and get to learn these characters the way they get to learn about each other, which is by going on an adventure with them and spending time with them.
I was to say, I think it's really cool how you kind of told the story, or you built the world around the story, not necessarily like right out the bat. Even though maps are cool, don't get me wrong. I love Lord of the Rings. I love seeing that map at the beginning from J.R.R. Tolkien came up with.
I love all that. But
it's really nice just to have the world kind of open up as we go on the adventure with our main character and her party.
Yeah. I think we made ourselves a couple of promises of like things we wouldn't do in comics. I think making a map is one of them. I have one in my head. Just because the world is actually starting to, like, stories that I'm writing require me to have it. I mean, it's not that important. I think I always want to leave as big a space in these stories for readers to put their own ideas and their own imaginations, and to not nail anything down too tightly other than what is required for the story. But, every place the story takes place, there's dozens of kind of names and places that we drop, and my own coming up reading stories, reading comics, I very often read something, you don't really understand it, or you don't fully grasp it probably in the way that the author intended, but it allows for these pockets for your own imagination to kind of, take root and run with it from there. And I think that those are always very, much more rewarding in a way, and much more long lasting than, I read a lot of fantasy novels, a lot of sci-fi, and sometimes they can get extremely specific, like down to the minutest detail. And I always find that, as pleasurable as it is to read that, I think that it's an over-controlling writer, an over-controlling author is almost like a vengeful god in fantasy. Is just like sometimes you need to take the pen away from people.
Scales and Scoundrels is such a big fantasy world that it seems like it would be great for more stories. Do you have plans to revisit this world?
I just yesterday finished writing the next book of Scales and Scoundrels.
Awesome.
So we have been very mum about this, but we have been working on this for some time. It's, I think, the biggest story we've told so far, and Galad is working hard at it. So it's still going to be a while, but we are shooting for hopefully next year. And I think anyone who's enjoyed it so far, this will definitely be one of our bigger stories.
Awesome. Well, I can
a lot of old faces, a lot of new faces.
I can think of 3 readers in this house that are looking forward to the next installment.
I love it.
I just want to say, talking about your characters, I like how you started off, like right off the bat, you kind of give this mystery to Luvander. It's kind of nice to see that there's a bit of a mystery built up with this character. And I really like how Galad's just simple animated background, to keep things as streamlined as possible, but still has all this great detail in the backgrounds and just this great cast of characters. And we've kind of focused on Luvander, but can you maybe tell us a little bit, tell our audience a little bit about where you came up with the other characters, like Dorma and Prince Askamor?
Yeah, the look at the core cast of characters is Luvander, who's the titular scoundrel, and she is clearly masked in mystery, but we meet her kind of immediately. You know, she always stirs the pot. She is constantly getting into trouble. You know, it's like my favorite kind of character is the you know, heart of gold, but you know, every other part of them is kind of mud splattered. And she quickly, over the course of the first, you know, chapter or two, comes across Dorma, who is a dwarven lady, which I always thought was funny because dwarves you don't get to really see the fairer sex of the dwarves. And Dorma is kind of also on an adventure. Everyone's always kind of on a journey. I always really like the sense that these are all, you know, like young characters in the fantasy terms. So Dorma, as you know, whatever the old is, like Frodo was, you know, whatever 50, which is young for a hobbit. And then the other main driving force are Prince Aki and his shadow Koro. So Prince Aki is of the royal family of the Scarlet Sands, which is a kind of a desert kingdom in this fantasy world, and royal, not just royal individuals, but in his case, they come with shadows, which are bodyguards from birth. So I like the idea that this kind of stalwart bodyguard was like the moment this prince was born, this baby that was also born from this shadow family was like, okay, you're gonna, you know, you have to learn how to walk faster than the royal baby because you need to protect him. And he is on a quest he's basically coming into his own age, you know, and kind of like, you know, whatever you decide that is, 15, 16 years. And the tradition of his kingdom is that he goes on a quest to become a man, you know, to kind of have a good reason to go on a quest. And I like that because I feel like these rituals, you know, kind of coming of age and especially like preparing a prince for power. A lot of what Scales is about under the hood is about power and how it's passed along and how it's objectified and how it's, of course, lusted after and how it corrupts you. And that each of our main characters is in some way the inheritor of a power or a privilege or a legacy that they might not actually want or that they have conflicting feelings about. So the conflicting thing for Aki is that he's actually a big fantasy nerd. Like he loves reading, you know, stories, and he loves all these tales of dragons that he's never seen. So of course he gets to sneak away from home on this journey. So he wants to go into the deepest, most dangerous and darkest dungeon and see what he can see. Because in the back of his mind, he knows that this is probably the last time he'll ever get to be this free. And his shadow, Koro, who again has been trained from birth to protect him, and whose honor is kind of personified in the protection of this young prince, wants none of that, wants only to keep him safe. Like, you know, let's just go to the tourist attractions, like tick the boxes and off we go. And he kind of wants to dive into the danger. And it was in their creation that I actually really thought like, oh, here's a fun dynamic, because we've got this kind of straight-laced, you know, warrior who does not want any trouble. And of course, Aki is incredibly infatuated with Lu, not necessarily romantically, but just because she's everything that he kind of wants to be. And he wants to follow her, you know, down every fantasy rabbit hole. And then we drop Dorma in there, which is revealed quite fairly as for a dwarf, she's afraid of the dark, which is incredibly, is just not a trait that jives well with, you know, underground cities and living your entire life in subterranean cities. So it's just kind of like, you could see that we both we clearly love high fantasy and love the classics, but also want to poke a little fun at them. And in doing that, I think that there's a way to keep them fresh, make them, you know, reclaim them as something that you experience as a child where you might not have understood all the lore. And I haven't read the Silmarillion yet. When I was first exploring it was actually interesting talking to Delad. We were like, we both love the Lord of the Rings, but we were trying to aim a little bit more for the Hobbit in the start of Scales, because the Hobbit is a lot more playful, and it's kind of before Tolkien decided to, you know, become a dungeon master. He just kind of wrote a fun fantasy story I believe it was for his kids. And there's a little bit more playfulness in that before it kind of became this, you know, this life's work of his, to create Middle Earth down to every Hobbit wedding tradition. It's just the scope that he went to.
It kind of goes back to you mentioning about how a writer will do every little minutia detail, and you were trying to avoid doing that. That's J.R. Tolkien right there for you. He had all the minutia.
I still do it. I just don't put all of it into the book. I have reams and reams and reams of like little story ideas and names and places, because you never know when you might be able to fit them in. And I had, we had all kinds of plans and ideas, and who knows, the story of Scales, the comic, is almost it's as big a journey, because we started off at Image. We were doing a monthly comic. We did that for a year. We did 12 issues in 12 months, which at the time was not often done. The sales weren't at the single issue sales weren't at the point where we could continue to do that. So we had to stop a little prematurely. The book was on hiatus for some time. We actually continued to make it on our own time and on our own dime, all the way until my personal journey led me to where I was now, editor-in-chief at TKO, and had established myself in that new venture enough to basically pitch my publishers on the idea of bringing Scales over to TKO and completing the story that we had set out to do. And that's what we ended up doing. And the book got a second life and went on to much grander things, because specifically we kind of identified that the market wasn't really in the monthly comic book space, but it was in thicker, in the trades, book collections, for libraries, bookstores. That's kind of where the readers for these types of stories are, not necessarily in the, comic book store every Wednesday. So, looking back, when we started Scales, I was, younger and less focused, and now I have got married and have a kid of my own, but we're still making these stories. We're still, exploring the world with these characters, and it's just a really wonderful thing to get to do. Also,
fantastic,
with someone that we just met through this way.
Especially trying to find time to be able to write and raise a kid and spend time with your wife and everything. It's just it's always hard. Yeah.
How did you and Galad make the book?
So we communicate almost exclusively via email, and we talk once a week, despite, I think, everything that's happened in the last number of years. Every Friday morning and afternoon, where he lives, we hop on Skype still. We haven't really aged out of that. And we just chat for an hour, and it's usually half about life and stuff. Are we reading books? Are we reading comics? What movies are we liking? And half about Scales. And usually every Friday I'll have some new ideas to throw at him. I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking about that. And he'll have some ideas. But, when we're working on a story like a book, I don't want to say how many books I have planned, because who knows how many will happen. But I kind of know what I would like to do, what I would like the big story. Like, here's where the characters start the next story, and here's where they're going to end up. And all the stuff in the middle, I've got a couple of tent poles, just developments or big story ideas that'll happen.
That sounds really cool.
And then we'll start kind of chiseling away at it, and he'll think about, I've always wanted to draw this, or, he'll come at it as an artist as a visuals perspective.
Neat.
And then he'll give that to me. He might sketch some things out. So over the course of the first couple of weeks, we both kind of just put all the ingredients that are in our heads on the table, and then we'll decide which ones do we want to use, which ones are good. And at some point, I kind of go away. I write an outline. An outline is basically like a short story. Like if I told you what happened in a comic without any of the art and not any of the kind of moments in place, just like boom, 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 boom. It's like telling your friend your favorite movie.
Like a summary?
Yeah, it's like a summary. And I'll send that back to him, and he'll read it, and he'll give me his ideas, and then I'll start to, we start ping-ponging back and forth. The ultimate goal is for me to write a script, which has, page 1, panel 1, Lou walks into the cave. The cave is dusty. There's a spider on the wall. Panel 2, Lou picks up a torch, looks around, looks scared, and then you write the dialogue. Send that over to Galad, and then he starts drawing. He sends me the thumbnails, which is just the very loose outlines, and then and then we make the comic. We've only met once. I flew to Corsica, which is the island that he lives on in France, on my honeymoon. And we hung out there, and we went on it's not true, we met twice. We went on a book tour in France. But it's very common in comics that you never meet your compatriot. And but it's very, I've worked on other books, and I think with Galad it's always very special because I can't point to any part of Scales that is like just me or just him. Like it's all us, kind of coming at it together.
That's awesome that you've built this rapport with him, and you guys were able to come up with this great story of Scales and Scoundrels. So you kind of mentioned TKO and the book first starting off at Image Comics, and that's where I first read it, and we ended up getting the trade from Image Comics. So for all our listeners that are interested in reading Scales and Scoundrels Volume 1, the TKO book has a different title. I believe it's called In the Dragon's Maw. Or did I get that flipped?
So In the Dragon's Maw was the original title for the first trade paperback at Image that collects chapters 1 through 5. I call them chapters now. They used to be issues. We're switching to chapters. It gets a little complicated, but basically we had to end the book at issue 12, chapter 12, and traditionally Image trade paperbacks are collections of 5 issues. So the first 2 trade paperbacks are issues 1 through 10, or chapter 1 through 10. Chapters 11 and 12 famously were never collected.
Okay.
But ideally they were a Dorma standalone 1-2 story. And then when we went to TKO, we decided to kind of double bundle it. So the first TKO book is now called Where Dragons Wander, and that's the first 10 issues or the first 10 chapters. And then the second book, called The Festival of Life, is all before uncollected. So it's issues 11, 12, and then all the way through 20, which was two whole new story arcs, actually.
Awesome.
So if you have the 2 TKO books, they're both over 250 pages. It's just over 500 pages total. That is the complete story of Scales and Scoundrels so far. And that's also the format that we will continue in.
Awesome. Logan and I have some more reading to do.
What does an editor-in-chief do?
So an editor-in-chief does everything that isn't the writing or the drawing of a comic. So an editor-in-chief is basically like the top editor. Beneath that, you have senior editors, assistant editors. But essentially what an editor, it doesn't matter where in that pyramid hierarchy you are, your job is to basically cultivate the books, whether they be comic books or prose novels or poetry, what have you. You're responsible for the creative output and kind of personal satisfaction of the creator, but also responsible for what the audience, what a reader will eventually get. So you have a large degree of freedom and creative input without actively being the person doing the actual creative work. So that can be, say at Marvel or DC, it's the superhero books, you're kind of given a couple of characters, right? When I was at Marvel, I worked in the X office, so we had all the X-Men. We weren't really responsible for Spider-Man or the Avengers, because those were, different offices. We were just gonna use the X-Men. So like with all the X-Men, and there's a lot of them, what are the stories we want to tell? Who are the writers we want to engage? Who are the artists we want to do? Because you could give 12 writers and 12 artists the same character with the same kind of idea, and they would come back with 12 completely different comics. So your job is to kind of identify, which is the best, or which is the most interesting, or which is the one that'll sell the most. Like, you just have to come at the problem from all these different angles. So as you work your way up through the ranks of editor, you get to basically just have more of everything. You get to have more books, you get to have a little bit more money, more budget, more ability to develop your own sensibilities. As editor-in-chief, you're basically at the way top of that. So as editor-in-chief of TKO, I oversee the entire creative output of TKO Studios. That means I'm involved in kind of all the story ideas, all the development, reaching out to creators and writers and artists, talking to them. I'm not the only one who does that. Like, my publishers, of course, are involved in that, but it's a pretty small group of people. And then you go through the list. You know, you got to hire artists. You got to get them all set up. You got to answer all their questions. You got to talk to them regardless of what time zone they're in, what language barriers there may be. And you do everything that that you do with when you're the writer on a book. You got to get thumbnails in, scripts in, workshop them. Once the book is done, you got to package it, you got to market it, you got to print it, you got to distribute it, you got to do press for it, it's a lot. You're responsible for making sure that when you go into a store and you want to read a new comic, that you have something to read, and you want to do it better than every other person doing it. So yeah, it's an odd job because, of course, you as a comic book reader, as a fan, you will know artists that you like, you will know writers that you like. Very, very few people bother to learn like who the editor is, and nor should they. It's not an editor's job to kind of get the clout or the fame. But they have a very big ability to kind of shape what a book becomes. Like I said, you could give the same character to 12 different writers and artists, but you could also give the same book to 12 different editors, and you would probably still get a different book out of it, because an editor can kind of, it's like everyone in the world makes peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but everyone makes them a little bit different. That might be something, like some people put pickles in them, some people put a little salt on the top, some people put, cheese in the middle. I don't know. It's just an idea. So there's all these like little proclivities that you can kind of use to change something that is actually at its core quite simple. A comic, not the hardest thing in the world to make, although it's quite difficult. And an editor can kind of take you this way, take you that way. And also, we're just there for the creators, artists, writers, everyone is working at their computers, at their desks, long hours. You tend to be a lifeline to them and explain the industry and talk about comics and art. And a lot of us don't get out much, so we have to give each other a little bit of social solidarity over the phone or over email, what have you. Sounds like
An editor-in-chief is like has several hats. Like he's a manager. He's also say a contractor. Someone who would as well as an architect for a house. You kind of have to oversee everything. A project manager. Project
manager, contractor, therapist, hitman, accountant. You can do all of them.
Nice. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just want to dive a little bit more into TKO Comics. Marvel and DC, they're the big two. They've been around since like the 30s, but TKO it only came on the scene in like 2018, and I noticed that not a lot of their books are available through like Diamond distribution. They seems like TKO has their own distribution method, their own way of getting the books out there. It's a rather unique company. Can you kind of like tell our listeners and tell us a little more about what TKO is like compared to like the big two or like those other comics like Image Comics?
Yeah. So TKO Studios launched in 2018. The kind of guiding premise at the time was that we binge release all our books, meaning that so we launched with 4 series that were all available as trade paperbacks, collecting kind of 6 individual issues, and also 6 individual issues in these box sets and digital. So the idea was that we kind of wanted to break the calendar cycle of comics at the time, that regardless if you were reading Marvel or Image or any of the other number of smaller publishers, everyone was kind of switching to trade paperback reading. The way you read Scales, you weren't going to buy issue 1 and then come back a month later and buy issue 2, because the direct market run through Diamond distribution was such that it was very, very difficult for independent books to actually retain readers that long, where you weren't cutting into your own profits by that point. So one of this is all like kind of market jargon, and half of that isn't even true anymore because the market's changed so much since then. But these are all things you have to be aware of. So the idea for TKO was that we don't go through Diamond distribution. We do our own distributing. We go directly to retailers. We're able to, oversee just the higher quality of our product with titles, and make them a really good deal, because when everything goes through one bottleneck, and that bottleneck is Diamond distribution at the time, a lot of people were kind of open to an alternative. And as we can see now, Marvel and DC have both gone their separate ways, and there's a lot more competition actually in terms of the direct market distribution. The other thing TKO wanted to do is essentially not do superheroes. That's the only thing we weren't really producing. Not because we don't love it, but because we just felt that there's a lot of comic book readers out there that market is very well served. And the final thing is that we just wanted to be, was our tagline, and a little bit of a shot across the bow, but be the first modern comic book company, where it doesn't matter where you hear about us. You can, the way you purchase basically any other item, any other pop culture good, be it, a music or a video game or an app, you hear about it, and within a click or two, you want to kind of have it. And with a comic book, that was still not really the case, unless, the trade paperback was out, but then which trade paperback do you buy? So we just kind of wanted to cut through all of that. So you go to tkopresents.com, or now you can also go to your comic book store, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Barnes & Nobles, wherever you have books, and our books should be there. And if they're not, you should let your bookstore know, or let your comic book store know to reach out to us, and we'll get in touch with them. All of our books are self-contained. All of our books are they're printed oversized, in terms of, I think pound for pound, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. We work with a lot of really great, established comic book, kind of legends like Garth Ennis and Steve Epting did one of our launch books, Sarah. We have, Jeff Lemire and Gabe Walta did Sentient for us, which is incredibly beautiful, just completely watercolor painted book, that took Gabriel Walta, I think something like 16 to 18 months.
Oh, wow.
That was the other thing, is that we were just able to put creators in a position where they were able to do work that they otherwise couldn't. Because we got Walta, talked to him, and he was like, oh, we're going to do a book together. It's about 150 pages. He's like, okay, who's going to color that? And we were like, we saw this on your Instagram. This looks really beautiful. Who colored that? He's like, oh, that's me. I'm a painter. I painted that. But if I can't paint a whole book like that. It would take too long. We asked, how long would it take? He's like, I don't know, a year and a half. We're like, okay, is that okay? Do you want to do that? And it turned into one of the most beautiful books I've ever worked on. And that's the kind of idea that we had, is that we just wanted to go for quality and make sure that it's kind of everyone's best work, ours and the creators, and put everyone in a position where they're not, the comic book market and the comic book business can be very stressful, that you're always almost working on several projects at once, 2 that you have to be working on to make ends meet, so you can kind of self-fund the one that you actually want to be doing. And with TKO, the idea is that we kind of cut through that. Let's put people in a position where they can do their best work, not have to worry about, 3 or 4 other gigs. We'll put the book out. As a publisher, we don't publish as many books. We do something like 10 to 12 projects a year, because we also want to give every book an opportunity to kind of be very special, to be the TKO book of this season, or of the spring of this year, next year, and to not kind of cut into our own production that way, basically, where, if you're shotgunning out 10 books every quarter, more sometimes, how is a reader going to look? I go to a used bookstore here in New York. It's called Book Off. It's great. But man, it is a wake-up call when you walk into an aisle and there's 30 bookcases in there and they're all comics and none of them have the covers out. It's just spines. And I'm like, at some point your book's going to land in a pile like this, and how are they going to stand out? Like, it's just the spine, it's just the logo,
right.
you know? So you got to be very conscientious about like just what you're up against. And then, you know, we launched very strong. COVID happened, of course, and that put us in in the same position as everyone. The industry was changing. Comic book stores had to close. But the fact that we weren't being distributed by Diamond actually benefited us, because we were able to continue to ship our books, and Diamond had to, you know, very famously shut down because when the pandemic hit, and we were able to use, you know, some kind of modern e-commerce guidelines where you could still purchase TKO titles through our website, but you were able to tag your local comic book store, and then we ended up sending that store the same amount that they would have gotten had you purchased that book in their store.
That's awesome.
So just kind of like using, you know, modern, just the technologies that we have now to still kind of, you know, make sure that brick and mortar comic book stores aren't left behind in the changing world. And even since then, things have changed massively.
Yeah, I have to say I really enjoy what I've seen from TKO. I think you guys have a much higher I wouldn't say a higher quality, but you have a quality standard you guys tend to stick towards, and I think it looks great. The story that we read, Scales and Scoundrels, is phenomenal.
Thank you.
I have to admit, though, being a dad who's introducing comics to kids, I'm always looking for more for all ages books. So when I was on your guys' website and I seen for all ages, and there was just Scales and Scoundrels and that one other one, I'm like, let's see a few more titles. And now that you've said you have more Scales and Scoundrels coming out, we're really looking forward to that.
Oh, I'm excited. Yeah, the all ages line. We've got we launched with Scales. We have Jelia by Juni Ba, who's a really just massive talent. We're very, very excited. It was his debut book. It's a French Senegalese cartoonist. He's since gone on to do many, many more books, and we have another book with him coming out soon as well.
Awesome.
So he's someone you should definitely check out. It's a little more. I don't actually know how to describe it. It's a fantasy. It's got a little bit of post-apocalypse in it, but in a kind of joyful, comical way. And it follows it's inspired by Juni's, the kind of myths and fairy tales of his native Senegal, where they have the Jelly, which are the royal storytellers who basically accompany, Jelly accompanies the king of this fallen kingdom because the world was destroyed, and is trying to kind of like rebuild his honor and his glory while he's just kind of trying to get out from under it. So it's a really wild story. It's got a lot of, I don't know if you've ever read the original Dragon Ball, which is always one of my favorite comics to suggest to people of any age, and Bone. So it's got a lot of those those comics that I love the most, that you can legitimately, they look like kids comics, but they are for kids because kids are incredibly smart and have the most discerning taste and are absolutely voracious readers. So when someone says something is for kids, I'm always like, oh, then it must be pretty good, because kids will let you know when something is not good.
Oh yeah, yeah. They kind of get that, especially with Logan. He gives me that kind of glazed look in his eye, and I apologize, Logan. I kind of monopolized most of our interview, but is there anything any other questions you wanted to ask Mr. Girner on his book? No? Okay. All right. Well, you've given us a breakdown of some of TKO's new books coming out. You've already, I guess, breaking news we got for Scales and Scoundrels.
Yeah, scoop.
All right. Is there anything else that you want? Anyone want to follow you on Facebook where they can go and check out some of your stuff?
I am not on Facebook, but you can follow me on Twitter as long as it's still chugging along, SGIRNER. Instagram is the same tag, but there I'm usually just posting pictures of goats and my dog, but that's quality content. You should check out TKO Studios at TKO Presents across all social media, and we're always posting fun stuff there. but no, beyond that, we're here, for the long haul, and I'm very excited, to put out more books and write more books, and you'll see me. Hopefully, you'll be seeing more of my work and at TKO and other places as well. And just keep reading comics, keep letting us know if you like them, and we'll keep making more of them.
Fantastic. You keep making them, we'll keep reading them.
Excellent.
So
good deal.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen of all ages, this has been Comics with My Kids podcast. If you've enjoyed this discussion, then leave us a rating or review over at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or Podchaser. If you'd like to follow us, check us out on Twitter at Comics with Kids, or our Facebook page, the Comics Corner Box / Comics with My Kids. Please check out our previous episode where Melody and I actually discuss her thoughts on the book Scales and Scoundrels. So this has been Matt D.
And I'm Logan D.
And we're here with
Sebastian Girner.
And you all have a wonderful night.